I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. Tonight, it is our pleasure to welcome back for the fourth time someone who I choose to believe has come to think of this library as his home away from home. I'm speaking, of course, of Dr. Zachary Karabell, optimistic contrarian and polymath extraordinaire, who has given talks here on topics ranging from U.S.-China relations to the remarkable presidency of Chester Alan Arthur. This time he's returned for a presentation about his newest book, The Leading Indicators, a short history of the numbers that rule our world. So, a brief story. When my children were younger, which is to say when they were in elementary school and I was actually able to help them with their math homework, that's totally beyond my capacity now. I was fond of trying to take whatever basic arithmetic problems that they were working on and put them in the context of their everyday world. In other words, if they wanted a toy and it cost X dollars and they received Y dollars in compensation for doing some household task, I would ask them to figure out how many times they would have to complete that given chore before they would have saved up the required amount of money. Sometimes, of course, they would get a little irritated with me for turning this request into a forced educational exercise, to which I always answered, almost everything in life can be reduced to a math problem. You might as well start figuring that out now. Yes, I'm a pill at home too. As adults, of course, we are bombarded by numbers on a daily basis. Some are up, some are down. Some look good, others seem to be a cause for concern. Some are commonplace, like the Consumer Price Index or the monthly unemployment rate. Others are somewhat more obscure, like the Purchasing Managers Index or the various data points contained in the Census Bureau's Durable Goods Report. What's the deal with all these numbers? What are they really telling us? And considering that so many of them were devised between 50 and 75 years ago, when the world economy was organized in ways that bear only the faintest resemblance to the present day, the question naturally arises, are they even any good anymore? Zachary Karabell has invested many years in pondering these questions as well. And given his Renaissance man-like status of being an historian who understands business, an author with unusually gifted narrative abilities that also knows how to manage money, and a guy who really derives pleasure from crunching data to analyze political and economic trends, I am prone to agree with his findings, which he might summarize as follows. If you want to follow a roadmap printed before the interstate highway system was built, don't be surprised if you hit a couple of dead ends. All of this is explained in far more detail in Zachary's newest book, The Leading Indicators, a short history of the numbers that rule our world, on which tonight's talk is based. The Leading Indicators is, of course, for sale, and Zachary will be signing copies following his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a great friend of the Kansas City Public Library, Dr. Zachary Karabell.
Thanks, Henry. I'm going to move this back a tad so that I don't run into it. I feel like I'm about to do a magic trick, but I'm not. The only magic trick I'm about to do is to try to make numbers actually seem interesting. You know, I have this habit of writing books that I'm very interested in and quite passionate about, but do not have the most obvious audience, although it's wonderful that you are an obvious audience and are here tonight. You know, I wrote a book about Chester Alan Arthur, as Henry said, and gave a talk in Kansas City, I think 3 or 4 years ago, and 500 people came. I didn't know the 500 people knew who Chester Alan Arthur was, so that was actually quite illuminating for me. I wrote a book about Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence, a history of peace between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. A book that elicited occasional peals of laughter when I told my friends, you know, oh, that must be a very short book. And a book about the history of our economic numbers, of our statistics, which, you know, I admit in my own thinking about this, I would have moments when I was writing this book where I thought, really? I'm writing a book about numbers and economic statistics, and this is the best thing I could think to do with my leisure time. But this came out of a number of years where, particularly in managing money and thinking about the nature of business, the degree to which, first of all in the financial world, that vast and at least important in the sheer size of dollars that are involved, decisions that are made predicated on what these numbers say and what direction they are pointing, was astonishing. And even more astonishing when you step back, which very few people do, and think about what it is these numbers do or do not tell us about the world that we're actually living in. Because the presumption of hearing about these things, which I think all of us, whether we are interested in these or not, are subject to the metronomic regularity of these numbers that come at us on weekly bases and monthly bases. It's impossible not to hear discussion about GDP. It's impossible not to hear discussion about the unemployment rate, or about inflation, or about trade. These numbers suffuse our sensibility about the world we're living in, and they do animate extremely consequential decisions. Do investors invest? Do businesses spend and hire? Do all of us buy a house? Or what degree do we or do we not get or encourage our children or grandchildren to get? Does government spend trillions of dollars or not? Based largely on which arrow these numbers are pointing in. And we act like they tell us something absolute about the world. And the more I looked into what it is these tell us, because I was curious, right? What is this thing called an unemployment rate? Do we go around the country and count 320 million people as we do in our decennial census and actually figure out, do you have a job, do you have a job, do you have a job? No, we don't do that. And one of the things I write about in the book is the disjuncture between these numbers as statistics, which they are, and these numbers as absolute snapshots of our world, which they're not. But we discuss the world as if they are. And in fact, with the waning of the Cold War, the waning of war, the waning of states in competition in quite that way. I mean, obviously the United States has fought 2 wars in the past 13 years, but the way in which countries understand their relationship to each other has increasingly been defined by numbers, by statistics, right? Increasingly, we think of power in the world not as a function of armies, not as a function of weapons, but as a function of GDP. Is your GDP bigger than my GDP? Is your per capita income bigger than my per capita income? As Henry said, I wrote a book about China. I managed some money that invested in Chinese and US companies for years. And the whole discussion about China was often undergirded by, is their GDP going to get bigger than our GDP? And if their GDP gets bigger than our GDP, does that make them better, more powerful, more successful? And as I'll talk about in a moment, that already the echoes of that begun during the Cold War, which by virtue of being a Cold War and not a hot war, was often a contest of whose economic system was better than the others. Were our appliances better than Soviet appliances? Were our cars better than Soviet cars? In fact, Nixon, who was vice president in 1958, and Khrushchev have a famous confrontation in a GE model kitchen when Khrushchev comes to the United States, called the kitchen debate, where they literally square off about the relative merits of each other's systems, and it's in front of a bunch of appliances, thereby underscoring the whole way in which this had become not a contest of is our country more powerful than yours or can we beat you, but is our refrigerator better than your refrigerator? And the way in which our economic statistics measure a particular world and come out of a particular moment in time is something I think we understandably forget, because we don't often think about the antecedents of the world we're living in. We kind of take it as it is. That's human nature. But if you step back for a moment from this slew of numbers that have become ever more important, particularly in the wake of the financial crisis, if you think about the unemployment report becoming a constant and repeated factor of the 2012 election, as a way of judging whether or not the Obama administration had or had not succeeded in turning the corner of the financial crisis. I mean, that number alone, how many people remember every month this statement of no president has ever been reelected with an unemployment rate greater than, I think it was 7.2%. Anyone just remember this as a kind of, well, you'll have to just take my word for it then, because,
You talk so fast, I can't follow.
I'm sorry. I will do my best, but it's think of it like a jazz thing for Kansas City. Eventually things will start to make sense, or you'll just be lulled into kind of a pleasant daze. One of the two. So these numbers have become a central factor of the world we're living in. But they do not, in my opinion, actually measure the world we're living in. And largely, they don't measure the world we're living in because they were not invented or created to measure the world we're living in. Everything has a story. Everything has a history. And while history is not determinative, it's not a straitjacket, and history does not, in my view, repeat itself. Historians do repeat each other, but history does not repeat itself. Understanding where we came from, understanding the structures of the world that we live in is part of how we can gauge what the world that we're actually in is. And these numbers, like people, have biographies. They have stories. They are not naturally occurring phenomena. They are not laws of nature, and they are not laws of physics. They were created and invented. They are numbers that were made up. In fact, this whole thing we call the economy is an invention. It's a creation. There is no the economy kind of out there in the world that people woke up 2,000 years ago in the Pliocene age and went, wow, how's the economy today? In fact, until the 1930s, no one used the word the economy. They didn't use the phrase the economy because there was no the economy to speak of because there were no numbers to measure it. This is not a statement of opinion. The only way I can make that statement is Google has a very quirky, one of their many quirky things that you wouldn't stumble upon but is something called Google Ngram. Google Ngram is the digitization of everything ever written by human beings until about 10 years ago in the age of copyright. And while copyright in various ways does not allow you to actually scan every single book, you can type in phrases into a Google Ngram to get a sense of their occurrence and their recurrence over the corpus of everything written. So if you type in the phrase the economy into a Google Ngram, you will find that until 1930 it basically does this. And then in about 1930, it does a hockey stick and begins to ascend where the mentions of it increase rapidly decade by decade by decade and continue high today. And the reason the words the economy aren't used until the 1930s is that without numbers like GDP and like unemployment and like inflation and like trade and like durable goods and supply managers, there's no thing there. Human societies talked about trade, and they talked about agriculture because rulers from time immemorial wanted to grasp how much farming was being done and how much trade was being done because those were the only sources of revenue in order to fund armies and fund the state. But other than trying to measure agricultural output and trade, there was no attempt to really measure any of the things we now talk about daily as actual things. The reason why I'm telling this history is because I think understanding how these numbers came to be and understanding exactly what they were designed to measure really helps us step back and recognize that we're not measuring the world we're living in. I mean, if there's any takeaway here, if everything else is too rapid and chaotic, we're not measuring the world we're living in. And we're not capable of measuring the world we're living in because we're using a set of tools, a toolkit, that was invented in the 1930s and 1940s to measure that world. And measure that world as well as anything could have. But we don't live in that world in any manner, shape, or form. We live in a world that has morphed rapidly, changed dramatically. And our numbers and this framework is just not able to keep up. They were great when they were invented. They were illuminating. They were brilliant. They were an attempt to quantify what had been amorphous and inchoate and unquantifiable. But if I gave you a 1950s Chevy today, which is a great car, at least I'm told that it was a great car. If I gave you that car today, that car that would have been like your hopes, your dreams, the thing you'd save money for in 1950, chances are pretty good you'd go, whew, not such a great car. No air conditioning, no anti-lock brakes, no cruise control, no stereo, no crank windows, not real good shock absorbers. A lot of stuff about that car looked really good then, doesn't look so good now. Same thing with our numbers. Really good then, not so good now. So until 1930, this just wasn't part of the warp and woof of any society anywhere. Then the Great Depression happens. And it wasn't the Great Depression when it happened. It was called the Great Depression later on. Nothing is called what it is while it's happening. It wasn't World War I when it was happening. It was just really bad stuff happening. So Great Depression happens. Herbert Hoover is president in the United States. And Herbert Hoover had been this apostle of scientific management. He believed that government could be more rational, business could be more rational, bureaucracy could be more rational. And by more rational, he meant collect, collate, analyze information better, and then design policies to answer problems based on that information. So 1929, 1930, it's clear that something is happening that's disruptive. It's clear that it's probably pretty bad, but it is totally unclear what's going on other than anecdotally. There are no numbers to show you. So anytime anybody reads that the unemployment rate in 1932 was 25%, no one had any idea what the unemployment rate was in 1930 or 31 or 32. We know retrospectively because we have these figures, but those numbers weren't invented in the framework to measure them, and there's nobody responsible for measuring them. There have been a couple of states that had thought about the dislocations of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. Massachusetts had begun some work about employment versus unemployment. There had been some work in the sleepy Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is an underfunded department in the Labor Department, in the Commerce Department, and then the Labor Department. But there had been no definition of unemployment versus employment. Most of these earlier statistics were about how many people were employed and what they were doing, which was just an outgrowth of the census of every 10 years. So there was this interest in how bad are things? What's going on? And Hoover himself wanted to be able to say things were not as bad as his critics were saying. So he, along with Congress, they fund the Bureau of Labor Statistics to do a first preliminary study of employment. And out of that comes not the unemployment rate as we know it, but the first sort of snapshot of employment that shows that things are really bad. And then allows Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 to run against Herbert Hoover, saying, look how bad things are. Look how many people are unemployed. And so Hoover is effectively hoist on his own statistical petard. The next thing that happens is defining what it actually means, right? You have to create a rate, you have to create an unemployment definition, because the unemployment rate is not how many people aren't working. It's how many people are trying to work who are not able to find jobs. And even that was very difficult. What does it mean to be trying to work? Does it mean you're sitting around wishing that a job would appear? Does it mean that you're actively looking for work? Does it mean you're capable of finding work? All those questions had to be worked out. And they're still not fully worked out, what all these things mean. But by the end of the 1930s and into the 1940s, you've sort of defined that to be unemployed, you have to be looking for work in a period of time proximate to when you are asked the question by a government surveyor. And initially, all this was just door-to-door knocking. And there were issues about how do you get people to fill out the forms correctly. A lot of the initial surveys were hired by the Works Progress Administration, which was hiring a lot of unemployed people who were not skilled or able to sort of survey, who would get bored. There was a lot of episodes of people going, God, I don't want to knock on another door. So they would sit down on a curb and just start filling out the forms. So there were problems about how do you collect and how do you sample and where do you sample? If you sample in Kansas City and St. Louis more than you sample in Detroit and Las Vegas, do you skew the sample? It took a long time. But primarily, this was a number meant to measure an industrial labor force that was becoming less agrarian and largely manufacturing. And it was meant to measure, are you looking for a job and do you have one? The other thing that happens in the 1930s is that the first inklings of what we now know as GDP is invented. And it's invented largely because with the New Deal in the United States and with the Labor government in Great Britain spending a lot of money to try to staunch whatever was going on that wasn't very clear, the political class needed to be able to say to people at the polls, look, we spent a lot of money and it did something good. But in order to prove that it did something good, you had to know what was and you had to know what it had become. And in order to know any of that, you had to start measuring this thing called national income and output, which had never been measured before. There had been some academic work and there had been some people around. And in the United States, this Russian immigrant economist who later wins the Nobel Prize named Simon Kuznets is brought in to help define national accounts, to count what it is this country is producing. And then there was Keynes in Great Britain and Sir Richard Stone and a bunch of other economists. And even that, it wasn't just all output. It was all output at market prices. And it wasn't just all output at market prices. It was output at market prices that you could actually assign a market price to. So one of the big debates around GDP in the 1930s, it wasn't even GDP then, it was national accounts, and then it became GNP, was what do you do about domestic work? What do you do about work at home? Cleaning, cooking, taking care of kids, all of which was perceived as vital to the health of any economy. But the decision was made because you couldn't easily assign a market price to it, we weren't going to count it. Not because it wasn't vital, just because it didn't have a market price. And there's a huge debate about this, and that was the decision that was made, with the full understanding that what you were measuring was an aspect of this thing called increasingly economic life, but not the totality of our output as people. And so you get national accounts that start to measure only final goods, right? Because you don't want to double count. If a factory in Toledo makes a part for a car, you don't want to count the output of that part and then count the car. So it's only the final goods, not the intermediate goods. And this stuff goes on for thousands of pages, even then. But the point is, there was a decision made to measure the output of a country because it fit a need. The need was, we're spending a lot of money as a government to try to stop whatever's going bad. Is it working? And the only way you could do that was by having one benchmark and then showing whether it had changed. And so by 1937, Franklin Roosevelt is saying in his speeches that national income has increased because of the programs of the New Deal. The final element that really solidifies this is World War II. Because the thing that you needed for the United States in particular in World War II was, if you're going to be the arsenal of the world, how much of your domestic production could you turn toward making tanks and guns and planes without so imperiling your domestic world, your domestic production, that you create scarcity of goods and trigger inflation? You didn't want to win the war and then lose the home front. You didn't want to win the war and then have a collapsed domestic system. And in order to do that, you had to have some sense of what the potential of this economic system was and what it was actually producing. And that's where GDP comes in, because it factors in the potential output of this thing called an economy. And at least in the eyes of those who were governing the war, the invention of GDP as a number is perceived to be as important for the American war effort as the creation of the nuclear bomb. Whether that's entirely true or not, that was the perception at the time, that this was the way in which the United States was able to fight the war and create a domestic manufacturing economy. So you enter, the 1940s and the 1950s with the framework of the numbers that we currently have. Unemployment, what becomes GDP. You also had a lot of work on prices, right? On inflation. This is the beginning of the Consumer Price Index to measure what the cost of living was. And what you're measuring at that period of time is that world, a world that was characterized almost entirely by American manufacturing undergirding the US economy, and by American manufacturing undergirding the global economy. That's what these numbers measure. They measure the manufacturing output of 1950s industrial nation states. And in the 1950s, these numbers go global. They go global because the UN adopts the same framework, and part of the UN mandate is economic security and not just national security, even though the thing we tend to remember entirely is the national security part. And when new nations start getting formed in the 1950s, decolonized nations start getting formed out of the rump of the British and French and German empires, they are often in need of some foreign aid via the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or some lending agency. The entire criteria of lending to these new countries is very much the same question that animated the New Deal. If we're going to give you money to have economic growth, you have to be able to demonstrate that that money has been used and that economic growth happened. So every country in the world starts measuring its output the same way the United States is measuring its output. So within about 10 years, you go from a world where nobody's measuring output to a world where everybody is. If you're a new country in the 1950s, you do about 5 things when you become independent. You've got a big ceremony, a flag raising, a band plays, you open a national airline, you create a national army, and you start measuring GDP. And then you have a world where these numbers are ubiquitous, having had a world where 20 years before these numbers didn't exist at all. And that is the world we live in today. We are with the framework of those numbers today. None of the numbers that we now use to gauge what's going on were created in any fundamental way after that period of time. So much like we have a government system in the form of a Pentagon or a national security bureaucracy in the United States or elsewhere in the world, we have a statistical framework that has evolved somewhat, but is very much bears the DNA of that moment. So the question is, what does that world measure? What do those numbers measure versus what's the world we're living in? And I think over time, we've had an increasing gap open up between what these numbers tell us about the world we're living in and the world that we all daily experience. And it is a reason for why there's so much confusion about, we're told the world's X, and then we make decisions based on it. And increasingly, those decisions seem not to follow suit. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. In February of 2009, President Obama announces the still controversial stimulus plan of about $787 billion in the midst of this financial crisis. And he announces it claiming that $787 billion will be spent, and as a result, 3.5 million jobs will be saved or created because of this money. Now, I'm fascinated by that statement, not from the partisan perspective. This is still the source of huge controversy, like we spent all this money, where are the jobs? What's really interesting about that, from the perspective that I'm talking about, is what world do we live in that allows the leader of a country to stand up and make a very specific statement about a very specific dollar amount that's going to lead to an utterly specific number of jobs created? You know, he didn't get up and say, things are really bad. Things are falling apart. We need to do something about it. We're going to spend a lot of money, and it's going to make things better. He said, we're going to spend $787 billion, and it's going to create 3.5 million jobs. Not 3.4, not 3.6, 3.5. How can you make that statement, right? What is it about the world we're living in that allows for that? That's an extremely mechanistic statement. It acts like there's this machine here, right? And we know exactly how many dollars we need to spend in order to generate each new statistical job. Now, 5 years later, those 3.5 million jobs may or may not have been created or saved, depending on who you listen to. First of all, the advantage of saying that they were saved is that you don't get to replay the tape. So maybe they were saved and maybe they were not. And I mean that, perfectly honestly. They may in fact have been saved. They may in fact have not. There is absolutely no way, other than an ideological argument, that you can make a case for that. It's unlikely they were created, because even by the measures of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, whereby all the employment lost post-2008 have now been statistically restored, there's not 3.5 million more. So why didn't that work? First of all, that number comes out of an assumption that is directly related to the story I told before, a 1930s and 40s framework that understands this thing called an economy as a closed system defined by a set of numbers like GDP and employment and inflation. That says, look, if you spend X, you create a certain amount of employment. Because over the 50 or 60 years that those numbers were kept, if you looked at government spending and then subsequent employment, you could create a pattern that said to you, it takes this much spending to create this much employment. But think about it. If those numbers were only in place from the mid-1940s onward, and that speech was made in February of 2009, at most, you're talking about 60 years of human experience, with 3 or 4 major recessions and a few other minor recessions. And then even if you added in other countries and tried to get the example, maybe you're dealing with 15 times where you can say government spent X and this amount of jobs were created. What's extraordinary is that there are lots of people schooled in economics, in government policy, who believe entirely that this is a mathematically calculable problem that is amenable to that kind of specificity, even though the numbers have only existed for 60 years. Now, it may be that if we keep these numbers for another 1,000 years and everything else stays equal, that we will have well enough data to make those kinds of assumptions. We will know enough to make those assumptions. There's no scientist in the world who would run an experiment 20 times and go, I know how this works. Right? It would take 20,000 times or intensive lab work. But the assumptions we now make about these numbers is that they are so absolute and the correlations between them are so clear that you can come up with a very specific numerical figure and have a very specific numerical result. And voila, that does not happen. Every single Congressional Budget Office projection today depends on a belief that you can mechanistically know the outcome of current spending on future spending based on 50 years of information. Read any CBO report. Actually, don't read any CBO report. But every single bill that gets suggested, whether it's Obamacare, whether it's Medicare Part D, whether it's the Ryan budget, gets scored by this Congressional Budget Office based on a formula that says this is what will happen. That formula is no different than the formula that led to $787 billion, 3.5 million jobs. It all just assumes we understand the system, input in, output out. Let me give you the other example, which is the employment number that I mentioned before that 4 of you knew about. No president has ever been reelected with an unemployment rate greater than 7.2%. It was repeated endlessly during the campaign as a way of saying that if the employment rate stayed at like 8%, which is about what it was in 2012, Obama couldn't get reelected because you can't get reelected as a president with the unemployment rate that high because no other president has ever gotten reelected with an unemployment rate that high. Okay, but as I mentioned before, there was no unemployment rate well until the 1940s. And as far as I can tell, there is no official announcement of an employment rate well until the 1950s. So let's say generously that there is an unemployment rate in 1948 when Truman ran for re-election, the local Sun, who I think some of you probably have heard of. So between 1948 and 2012, there were 16 presidential elections. Did I get that right? 16 presidents? Yes. 7 people ran for re-election. 2 people lost. Anyone remember who lost? Carter and which Bush? The older Bush, George H.W. So George Bush loses in 1992, Carter loses in 1980. But only 7 people have run for re-election in that entire time. Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, George Bush the younger. Lyndon Johnson doesn't count because he didn't get elected in the first place. Truman doesn't count because he didn't get elected for the first term. Ford doesn't count because he wasn't really president. This is not really live, so I'm okay with that. Now, if I said to you, no president has ever been reelected with an unemployment rate greater than 7.2%. If I said to you that the 2 times that a president has run for re-election with an unemployment rate greater than 7.2%, both have lost, that sounds like a very different statement than the first one. The first one sounds like a law. It's just the way it goes, and good luck changing that. The second one sounds like yeah, and your point is, but far more of what we do is the 2 times this has happened, both guys have lost, than laws of nature, including stimulus plan, including spending plans, because we just haven't been doing this long enough to make those sorts of statements. And in addition, just to make it worse, what we're measuring and what we're living in aren't the same. So GDP, which is taken as this sort of proxy, right, of are we doing well? There was a great critique of GDP in 1968 by Robert Kennedy, right as he was gearing up to do his presidential campaign. And he wrote a very passionate denouncement of GDP as it measures everything except that which makes life worth living. And his point was, even then, I mean, this was the beginning of that kind of 70s backlash against the overt materialism of American life, that GDP quantifies output. That's all it does. It's neutral about what that output is. So many people have observed this for years, that if Americans get more worried about crime and build more gated communities and hire more security guards to guard those gated communities, that entire process is GDP additive. It makes our GDP better. We've spent money building subdivisions, we've spent money building gates, we've spent money installing security systems, and then we spend ongoing money to hire security guards to make sure that it's safe. So from a GDP perspective, things have gotten better if you believe that the goal of government and society is just to maximize GDP. From a living perspective, that's highly questionable. Floods, the Missouri River floods, lots of greater Kansas City is underwater, things need to be rebuilt. Hurricane Sandy hits the Northeast, a lot of things, towns get destroyed, beaches get eroded. The billions upon billions of dollars that get spent to restore whatever damage those natural disasters did is really good for GDP. But I'm not sure we would say that the real goal or the real solution to our current problems is to have a series of natural disasters. If you are buying LED light bulbs in place of your incandescents, which most of us will now have to do because incandescents have been made illegal, like they're not being made anymore. The LED itself will cost you 10 times the amount of the incandescent bulb, but it will last you for 20 years. So your aggregate spending on lighting will go down, and the amount of energy that you have to spend, your electrical bills, will also go down. So from a GDP perspective, that's quite a negative. If a West Virginia coal plant floods a river with chemicals, and lots of people go to the hospital, and then the company gets fined, the fine, the hospital bills, and the cleanup are all really good for GDP. But again, I don't think flooding rivers with chemicals is the answer to our current economic ills. The point simply being GDP doesn't care. GDP is a neutral measurement of output without any attempt or design to make decisions that are human about whether or not that output is producing the society we want to live in. And the people who created these numbers, like Simon Kuznets, understood completely that these were just numbers to measure output. They were not numbers to measure, are we creating a society we want to live in? Same thing with employment. Employment figures are completely neutral about whether the job that you statistically have is a job that you personally want, need, or can sustain. So a job that pays you underneath the poverty rate for 35 hours a week of work is still a job that looks just as good in your unemployment report as the job that pays you $200,000 a year. Employment reports are neutral about income. They are simply measuring employment. And they're not even really measuring employment. They are measuring the employment of the people whose employment history they can actually reach because they answer the phone when you call them. And in a world where most 20-somethings increasingly do not actually possess a landline, they are not called. They are not called. Why? Not because the Bureau of Economic Analysis and Labor Statistics is ignorant of the fact that cell phones are now the primary mode of communication. This is not those people in Washington and statisticians are so stupid. It is, if you're going to sample 55,000 people out of a population of 320 million, once again, you want to make sure you're doing it right. What's the problem of a cell phone from the perspective of sampling? You can take that phone with you anywhere and live anywhere. You have a portable area code. So if your kids or your grandkids grew up in this area and then go to college somewhere else and they take their Kansas City area code with them, if you're trying to be statistically sampled by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in a geographically diverse fashion, and you call that phone, you have no way of knowing that that phone is actually belonging to someone who now lives in Missoula or Las Vegas or Phoenix. So the decision is made quite rationally to only use landlines because at least you know that the landline is where it actually is, even though the only people who pick up landlines to answer government surveys tend to be people 55 years or older who may or may not have a job because they're home to answer the phone. A problem that is well understood, but not an issue that anyone has figured out about what to do with. Final problem here is that all these numbers assume that we live in a national system that is amenable to the description of one number. All these numbers are just big averages. So let me put it to you this way in like the next 5 minutes and then offer what I think is the only answer. None of these numbers are real in the sense that they describe nothing that anybody here actually can relate to. None of us have an unemployment rate of 6.5% individually. No part of the country necessarily has that rate. It's just a national average of all the people we've decided are part of the workforce divided by the amount of people who statistically do not have a job, which means they've had to look for one, they have to answer the phone, and they have to say that they don't have a job. That's all that number is, and it acts like it's true in San Francisco, to Seattle, to Schenectady, to Sarasota. And it's not. At no point in the past 5 years has Nebraska had an unemployment rate greater than 5%, and at no point in the past 5 years has Greater Phoenix had an unemployment rate less than 10%. Central Florida, Las Vegas, Central California, Detroit have had a completely different dynamic than Greater Kansas City or Missouri. But we act like it's all the same and that we can design federal national policies that are designed to lower this thing called a national unemployment rate that fundamentally doesn't exist except as a number that represents something going on systemically. But policies designed to lower that rate make no sense because that rate doesn't exist except as a fictional national average. When I say fictional, I don't mean that it's not a real national average. I mean that you can't just bring down a national average by spending money to bring down the average. If you have completely different employment realities in Nebraska versus Las Vegas versus Phoenix versus Kansas versus Detroit, nor can you just spend money when you have completely different employment realities based on your education levels. You know, if you're a college-educated woman, you have an unemployment rate of 4%. If you're an African-American male without a high school degree, you have an employment rate of 10%, meaning you have an unemployment rate of 90% by some measures. I don't know if that's entirely right, but it's really high. The idea that there is one policy that's going to fit all those different realities is a real problem. That's true of every one of our numbers. You know, we're hearing a lot about income inequality and wealth inequality and per capita income. Per capita income is a terrible number to try to change because it's a terrible number to answer any question we have about is our economic system meeting our needs. Per capita income is all of our income added together, divided by the number of people in this room. And so if Bill Gates walks into this room, we are all per capita millionaires. And that tells us absolutely nothing about whether or not this economic system is meeting our needs or whether our own capacities are meeting our needs. And at every level, we live in a world where these numbers are increasingly detached from what it is we're actually trying to answer. So my solution in this is not, as would be most satisfactory, that we should create new numbers that better capture the world we're living in. And I didn't even get into all these other issues like Google, the internet, the free goods that we all use on the internet are completely uncapturable in our current GDP world. What is the GDP effect of Google? We have absolutely no idea because we don't even know how to measure it. I mean, there have been some economists who try to measure it. The way they try to measure it is they say, if you have a job and you are getting paid X, let's say you're getting paid $20 an hour, and you have a rational sense of exactly how much your time is worth, then every dollar of time you spend using Google is a rational act or decision to take that dollar of your time on a free service called Google, which means you are de facto spending a dollar on Google. And by that calculation, the free goods of the internet, whether it's Google or Yelp or OpenTable or whatever else we have, is adding $300 to $400 billion a year to our output. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad way of doing things, because frankly, there's no way of doing these things. So any way that's creative is interesting, albeit a little bit convoluted. The point is, we do a lot of things that we don't even know how to capture with numbers. And yet we assume that the numbers that we're using capture everything that we need to know. So I think the idea that you can create new simple numbers to replace old simple numbers is part of the problem. There is no simple number that's going to capture a multifaceted, three-dimensional world of trade and globalization and services. And we don't need one. So what I would say to all of you is there is no question in any of your lives, and this is true if you're an individual, it's true if you're retired, it's true if you're in college, it's true if you're running a business, and increasingly it's true if you're in government. There's almost no question that any of us have, that any of you have, that these numbers answer. Think about it. What question do you have in your lives that GDP answers? Or that the unemployment rate answers? Or that trade numbers answer? Or even that the national inflation rate answers? After all, the inflation rate we use excludes food and fuel because it's too volatile a number to help us figure things out statistically. It tells you nothing about your income level, and it tells you nothing about your desires versus your needs versus your wants. So even the inflation rate, were that to be your actual personal experience of inflation, which it isn't, doesn't necessarily tell you anything about is your life working the way you need it to. So I would say there's no question any of us has that it's actually answered by these numbers. And that any question any of us have are answered by information that we can all obtain much more easily than ever before, even as we cleave to these numbers more than ever before. So I'll take one simple example. Say you want to buy a home. Does it matter what the National Association of Home Builders says about housing starts? Does it matter what the National Association of Mortgage Lenders says about the average 30-year rate for a mortgage, fixed or floating? Does it matter whether or not national home prices or the Case-Shiller housing index of 16 urban areas went up last month or not? In my view, absolutely not, and it will lead you to the wrong decisions. The only thing you need to know is how much should homes cost in the mile to 5 mile radius of where you're buying one? What is your income? And what kind of loan can you get from a local bank at what rate? And all those questions you can now answer like that. You can go online, you can go onto like an app called Zillow, you can go onto Google, you can type it in, and you can find every single sale within the past 30 days, within a certain price range, and you can do it in an hour. And you can do it if you're computer illiterate. Maybe not totally illiterate, but largely illiterate. With Siri and other things, you can just say, tell me the... So, if you'd had to do that 10 years ago, if you'd gone to like the Kansas City registry or something and said, I would like every land deed and sale that's closed in the past 2 years within a mile of 12th Street, it is not clear that they would have given you that information, or that they would have given you that information with anything other than a 2-month lag or a 6-month lag. And then you would have had to go through every single one and try to figure out the closing price and remove the actual cost and then add it up. You can do it like that now. So the ability to create bespoke numbers, indicators that tell you what you need to do, your own data map of the world, and this is true if you're a business, it's largely true if you're a government, and it's definitely true if you're an individual, has never been greater. We have this immense capacity with big data to steer our lives with information that we find, whereas these things that we call the leading indicators lead very little and mislead a lot. I think these were precious when they were invented. I think they were brilliant. I think they shed light on what had been dark and unknown. But they did so 50 or 60 years ago. And our world has changed much more rapidly than our ability to measure it has. And that's not going to change. No one's campaigning on trillion-dollar spending globally on making better numbers. And no one will. And we don't need them to. What we need is to recognize that these things had their place. They tell us something about the world we're living in, and they answer almost no questions that any of us individually have, and we shouldn't pretend that they do. And instead, we've got this vast power at our fingertips to answer the questions we need with information we can find, and that's what we ought to be looking at. And to appreciate this statistical framework as helping move our history forward, and I do think our lives have moved forward more productively than not, but not cleave to them as guideposts in a world where they're increasingly not. So the rest of it's in the book, The Leading Indicators, and thank you so much for coming out. And we got about 20 minutes for questions. Yes?
There was a French economist who wrote a book recently about income inequality and people's ability to climb from one quintile to the next.
Right.
And then there's, I think, an MIT economist or something like that who studied the question for 10 years and threw up his hands and said, we don't have anything in the data.
Right. So the book is called Capital by Thomas Piketty, who's a French intellectual, and like many French intellectuals before, has become, the absolute darling of Americans. American intellectuals always want to be French intellectuals because French intellectuals are rock stars and American intellectuals are barely capable of having conversations in their own household. So Piketty wrote a book called Capital, Studying Income Inequality, and his conclusion is essentially that the nature of capitalism is to privilege capital over labor, and so that inequality is kind of an inevitable outbreak of the system, and unless you do something at a governmental level to change it, that's the direction it will go in. So it's a provocative argument. You're right, there was also an MIT economist whose name I'm now not remembering who had planned to write a book on this. Christopher Jenks. And it wasn't MIT, it was Chicago. He'd been in Chicago, and right, thank you. And Jenks had been, he actually had a book contract to write a book about income inequality, and after 10 years of looking at it, he said, you know what, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's bad, maybe it's not bad. There's some reasons to believe it is, there's some reasons to believe it's not. And I think what these point to is part of why Piketty, this book by Piketty called Capital, is compelling is because it's a simple synthetic thesis about what's going on. I happen to think it is a very provocative one about the nature of kind of where rewards go in a global system, whether it's toward capital or toward labor. Whether or not that's constructive or destructive, the problem with that is like what are you starting with, right? I mean, the reality is our income levels today are vastly higher than they were 50 years ago. They're higher than any group of people have ever been ever in human history, you know. Clearly the fact that, you know, there wasn't even rural electrification in the South at the time that GDP was created as a figure, and that our lives have materially improved immeasurably, is not a reality that we necessarily inhabit daily. You know, human beings, I always talk about this with particularly people complaining about inflation, right? People always remember their highest income and the lowest prices they paid. So, you know, when you get that cognitive reality, it becomes very difficult to know what the benchmark is inequality the thing that matters? Is inequality, you know, my own theory around this is inequality matters greatly when things are stagnant and hardly at all when things are improving. Meaning if everyone feels they're doing better, even if some people are doing vastly better, it's far more tenable than if everybody feels like they're doing the same, but a few people seem to be doing a lot better. So China, until recently, has vast income inequality, far greater than it was during the 1950s. You know, I mean, it's a lot worse from income inequality perspective in China today. But there's hardly a Chinese person you would meet, or at least I would think there's 1.6 billion people. I'm sure you could meet anybody who could say just about anything. But, you know, it's better to be alive in China today than it was when there was a lot less income inequality, because there's a lot more opportunity to create income, or at least to make your material lives better. The issue in the United States or Europe today is, are we in stagnant systems where a few people are doing better, and is that politically tenable, but does it actually matter to the ability of individuals? And we're all using these kind of numbers, right? Income numbers are a problem. They are a problem in my view because while they measure income, and you can do something to measure the standard of living, you cannot measure people's expectations about what they think their standard of living ought to be. I mean, I'm sure there are statisticians attempting to do so. I know for a fact there are. That's a really, really complicated thing because it's also a moving target. You know, my expectations, your expectations are not the same year in, year out. There's no clear what our sense of what our lives should be. And inequality has a lot to do with, am I living the life I think I ought to be living? Maybe it has a lot to do with, am I living the life that I should morally be entitled to be living? But where you get at that, I have no idea. And I think that's partly why Jenks made a more honest decision to say, you know, I don't know what to do with this. Whereas I think Piketty's making a really interesting observation about just the nature of rewards, relative rewards. That's a different argument, right? It is clear that the relative rewards in this system go largely to money and almost not at all to wages and labor, right? But whether or not that is as deleterious or not, I think is a much more open argument. Sir?
What indicator would you say is good to watch to see how the economy really...
You know, I think it is an absolutely crucial question. I now ask myself this more than I ever have, and I find... Sorry, the question is, what indicator would I use or would one use to really get at the economy? And I said, I think it's a great and important question. It is one that I ask myself repeatedly, and increasingly I do not have a good answer for. And I would love to be able to say, in a moment, I would love to be able to have an answer for, because it would be satisfying. I don't think it's as realistic. I think much more realistic is, what's the question, right? In the sense of, you know, I think GDP is interesting in that it does measure aggregate output, but it tells you nothing about wages. I mean, we could live in a world now where GDP goes up because factories are producing more with robots and software, and wages go down because you don't need people to actually produce it. And that's not a world that any of us grew up in, and it's not a world that we expect, but it's clearly a world that's possible. So I don't have a good answer. I think it's much more of a lattice of all of this based on our basic needs being met. Is capital being allocated well? Are we producing things in a way that is likely to lead to a sustainable future? Meaning, is our spending in life much more oriented toward present consumption versus future gain? And I think there are a lot of issues in that. Meaning, is our economy based on short-term consumption or long-term sustainability? And you can get at that based on consumption, retail spending numbers versus investment. I don't mean investment in stocks, I mean investment in, you know, roads or education. But even there, it's hard to know what the right ratio is. But I mean, those are the kinds of things that I tend to look at when I think about, are we living in a system that's long-term sustainable? And finally, are we innovating? Meaning, is there fluidity and change? So it's not is manufacturing or the traditional nature of American labor being eroded, is something being created that has a potential to be a locus. And the jury is largely out on that one. I could make arguments for why I think there's a lot of innovation that is likely to lead us forward more than we think, but I can't prove it. So, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, something does come to mind in terms of economic indicators that was absolutely spot on, and that was the fall IMF World Economic Outlook. I mean, it didn't matter where you lived in the world, that report, which was very grim, told you that we were headed for serious trouble. And I wonder if you would put that caveat on what you're saying at large, namely, if there is some catastrophic event on the horizon or some miraculous recovery on the horizon, do these numbers start to become more?
So you mean the fall of 2008? I mean, so the IMF has releases 2007 releases an annual, world outlook every year, as does the World Bank, as does a few other global organizations. The problem with those, in my mind, is that they are, just by structure, limited by the national data of each of the countries, as is the UN. Meaning we are not able yet, and no one does, collect kind of global system level information. So if we live in a global economy, we're still, our view of that economy is the product of lots of national figures added up. Because there's nobody who understands.
Even UNCTAD does that.
It doesn't. I mean, it does within what it can, but everybody is either the product of their funding or the information they can obtain. Like, there's nobody who collects global prices or global money supply because there's no way for us to do so right now. Global prices we're starting to be able to do because you can do it online. You can actually collect online prices irrespective of a border, smooth them out in terms of currency, and then create some snapshot of global prices. But until recently, really, it has been national. And the UN is, by mandate, it is captive of the national reporting. Even the Human Development Index, which is a UN attempt to get at a different aspect, including education, health, longevity, to replace GDP, created by Amartya Sen. Even they have to use national data. So, I mean, you're totally right. The IMF saw things that are negative. The problem is that every IMF report since then has been quite negative in a way that's been incorrect about what's gone on in 2009, 2010, 2011.
Never with the kind of verbiage they used in the fall.
No, but they are pretty chronically negative. If you look at, I mean, I'm sure, and you clearly do. They tend to skew to the negative. They skew to the risk, which makes sense given what's happened. I mean, I do think in general, and this is separate from the indicator side of things, that we live in a global financial system where the risks remain just as pronounced as they were in 2008 as today, and that's not going to change. And that there are a lot of benefits that have come with that, but none of the risks and none of the transparency about that world has changed fundamentally in 5 years. And today the markets fell 3%, if anyone noticed. It happened very quickly and for seemingly no reason. And that's, we live in this kind of chronic world where systemic collapse is a chronic risk if it happens. But if it doesn't happen, then it isn't happening. I mean, I think it's almost impossible to easily gauge, personally. Sir?
Yes. I think as you described in the 1930s, 1940s, and made a good point as to GDP was its Italian creation. In fact, I would go further as to say that all economic data, all indicators, their original saying is that they are theory inspired. I mean, GDP itself is inspired through dedication, economic analysis. But economics is a science where, perhaps the only science where two people can earn a Nobel Prize for saying exactly the opposite thing.
Right.
In fact, the last two just did.
Right. Right.
So what's relevant about an indicator for one theorist may not be, in fact, just completely different from the other theorists.
Right.
And that's the kind of work more dangerous than the indicator itself not being accurate in the sense that it doesn't capture enough of the economic.
Yeah, I mean, look, academic economists are, I think, more able to recognize there's different ways you can understand the world with the same set of numbers. It's when those economists become policy economists and are part of a policy framework, or they get hired by companies, that the need of those institutions for black and white answers about future outcomes trumps any of the reality that we don't understand. I mean, it's the same thing about scientists. You know, it's one thing to have abstract science, and another thing to be, you know, in a company trying to produce a product. So when economists' knowledge becomes tethered to either business or politics, it's forced into kind of a pathway of certainty that I think has been quite distorting in a way that a lot of the people who invented these numbers, like Kuznets and like others, would have been somewhat appalled by, right? Because they're like, hey, wait a minute, this is not meant to be an absolute answer. And Kuznets he's a terrible writer, so it's hard to find really good quotes from him, but he has something that you could beautifully paraphrase as, you know, the problem with these numbers when politicians get a hold of them is that they become handmaidens of what politicians want to argue, rather than, you know, descriptions that are malleable and that are limited and that are provisional. Let's have one more question, sorry, and then we can take it offline.
Thank you. I have a twofold question about the housing market in Western States. Number one, is there any other Western nation in the world that has an institution so enslaving and life bondage making as the American housing market? And number two, made it this way and why?
So you could actually say that a lot of European countries, which do not allow you to go into personal bankruptcy and get out from under a bad housing loan, are far more punitive for decisions that turn out to be wrong than the American housing market, where you can in fact write off and have your house go into foreclosure. It's actually much easier to get rid of your foreclosure obligations than it is to get rid of your credit card debt, because when the laws changed in 2006, it used to be the other way around. Now it's credit card debt that you'll, you know, carry with you till the end of your days. That and student loan debt, which is very hard to get out of too. So while it's clearly a huge weight, it's actually somewhat less burdensome here than it is in most European countries, which is why you didn't have quite the same level of a housing bubble to begin with, because the pain of being wrong is substantially greater. The thing that makes it that way in the United States, though, is that at some point in the 20th century after the Depression, this notion, and maybe even in the homesteading world of the 19th century, which is how everybody who's here, you know, at some point got here, the idea of land as freedom and land as personal autonomy versus government, and, you know, with land you had to build something to live in, is deeply part of this consciousness that became ever more so in the 20th century, whereby owning a home is perceived as somehow part and parcel not just of the American dream, but of the kind of being free.
Because isn't it true that in many European nations, this are passed on over centuries?
Yeah, although that's less and less true. I mean, it's certainly true to some degree in Spain and Greece and Italy. It's less true in Northern Europe, certainly not really true in Germany. So it really depends. But you know, we have both a very favorable set of policies that make it economically, it makes it seem economically wise to own, and makes it very easy to own too much. So I think with that, we'll do some questions offline. Thank you.